there's a lot of things we believe about the world, but the way we're actually living together doesn't mesh with that very well. Most of us long for the simplest things like friendship, like belonging. We want to live at a slower pace, but we just don't quite know how to do this.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bomberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here today with author Winn Collier. Welcome, Winn. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, your new book is sort of a genre-bending kind of work. Can you tell us sort of what it is and how it's shaped?
Sure. Well, it kind of does a couple different things because I am a pastor, and my main character in this fictional novel is a pastor. So there's parts of me and my pastoral life that are in there, but it's not me. These are new characters in a place that doesn't actually exist, but they reflect the life and the yearnings of many of us who are wanting something rich and deep in our life with God, but confused and tired and often have more questions than we have answers, and are perhaps discouraged or disenfranchised by the church experience that we often have, and yet we want something sturdy, something real. And so these are very real characters, and it follows a 10-year a relationship between a pastor and his congregation.
In some ways, the storyline of the book seems rather simple, rather ordinary. Pastor comes to a rural parish, writes them letters about their shared life together, and yet there's so much going on here under the surface. Tell us about this community, about this pastor, about some of the people in his parish that you really come to know and love through these letters.
Yeah. Well, Jonas McAnn is the pastor. Jonas McAnn was a longtime pastor, but had found himself unable to pastor anymore. It was almost as if the world that he was created to live in and work in and serve didn't exist anymore. And so he stepped away from pastoring, found himself in a cubicle selling insurance, and but over the years his call wouldn't ever leave him. And so there's a small struggling church, Granby Presbyterian Church in Granby, Virginia, and they were looking for a pastor. They were also exhausted and tired because almost every pastoral candidate they found had some grand dream for who this church was to be, some new model, some new way, but none of it honored who they actually were. None of it honored the place where they actually lived. None of the pastors considering coming there seemed to want to know them and be with them. And so it was like a marriage between an exhausted pastor and an exhausted church, but that they both weren't just exhausted, they had a lot of hope for their life together. And so there's Don Brady. He's a main character, and he's kind of a large Herculean man who's comes to faith later in life, and you follow some of his stories. He's a rough around the edges, but a really tender-hearted bear of a man. There's Jonas's family. There's lots of parishioners you meet. There's the county prosecutor, and it's really, at the end of the day, it's a company of friends, and it's also a blending of the secular sacred divide, because you also have community and spirituality happening among a group of people who meet in a local coffee shop. Their group is called the Order of the Roasted Bean, and there's just a lot of meshing and life shared back and forth. And so it's really about a community of people living together in a very simple, ordinary, plain way. But it seems to me this is the reality of life. This is the way most of our lives actually are. And so the stories feel very real to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're publishing this book into a world where a lot of churches are experiencing a lot of anxiety, feeling a lot of unfulfilled ambition, having expectations, churches for pastors and pastors for churches that are not being met. In what ways do those expectations really cause frustration, and how does your book speak to that moment?
Yeah. Well, I feel like we're living in a moment where a lot of our humanity is being robbed from us. I feel like there's a lot of things we believe about the world, but the way we're actually living together doesn't mesh with that very well. And I think that most of us long for the simplest things like friendship, like belonging, like integrity in our relationships. We want to live at a slower pace, but we just don't quite know how to do this. And I think the people I encountered in Granby, it was just allowing space for these yearnings to actually rise to the surface. And I think maybe they had just hit enough hard walls, had just had enough discouragement to actually be willing to try life a different way. But it is incredibly plain. I mean, there's nothing flashy about the folks in Granby, but there's nothing flashy about me. There's nothing flashy about the people that I live with in my church. So I feel like it's really just creating enough space for people to actually hear one another. I think one of the most indicting lines that I found in this story was when a couple of the people from the pastoral search committee of Granby Presbyterian recognized that they had encountered a lot of pastors, but no pastors that really wanted to know their names. And so I think it's really about knowing people and allowing the space to do that, and it requires a pastor to come in without a preset agenda of what this community is supposed to be, and be more curious about who this community is and who it can become. And likewise, the church to the pastor, not having a preset idea of exactly what role a pastor is supposed to fulfill, or the answers a pastor is supposed to have, or any of those sorts of things, but a curiosity about what kind of friendship can be built. So I find that really helpful.
Yeah. In what way obviously you have real life experience. You could have written a nonfiction book about this need for these long, deep relationships between pastor and church. And yet you wrote this book in a fictionalized place with fictionalized people. How did that choice give you a freedom, or did it give you a freedom to be honest in a way that perhaps you couldn't have been if you were writing about your own personal experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think that part of it was I found myself in a place where I was tired of just my own words, my own ideas, and I wanted to explore a story that would move out of just my own words. I mean, obviously I wrote it, but it's different than writing your own theological perspective. Also, the reality is I'm at heart, I'm a storyteller, and I just felt a strong desire to explore what fiction can do, and I'm a really strong believer in the power of a beautiful story. And sometimes, particularly in Christian writing, I think stories can become props for us, and I was really eager to have a shot to not use a story as a prop, but to let it live and breathe and have its own, life. And I think in some ways this book may actually raise more questions than answers sometimes. And to me, that feels like that's exactly the way life is. And so I was really eager for it.
Now, you have structured the book as a series of letters. Why did you make this particular creative choice, and what do you think is special about letter writing as a form of communication?
Yeah, that was really purposeful because, while we say that the story of Thomas McAnn in Granby is plain and ordinary, it absolutely is. I don't actually know many pastors who write long-form letters to their church, particularly ones that aren't trying to raise funds or preach a sermon, but literally just write a letter. Sometimes offering some insight, sometimes telling a story, giving their own perspective on their own life, asking questions of their congregation. It probably grew first out of two things. One was I've had an idea for a long time that I would like to just write letters to our church. Actually haven't done that yet. So I'm very hypocritical. But I have thought oftentimes about how lovely it would be. It's something that you can't do with an email blast. There's something very different about receiving a letter in your mailbox, hopefully with a hand signature, and it's a leisurely letter, not something you're going to read in a 15-second moment, but something that you're perhaps going to sit by the bedside table or on the coffee table, and later that evening, when the sun's going down and you have a cup of tea in your hand, you're going to settle down at your couch, you're going to read this letter from a friend. That's just really different. But the actual story emerged when a dear friend of ours, their church in Colorado had their pastor had left, and they were about to be searching for a new pastor, and she was going to be on the search committee. And she called me, and her voice was really tired because the prospect of finding the kind of person that she felt like would honor her congregation, would honor the people they were, felt daunting to her. So she asked for my advice. And I thought about it for a couple days, and the opening story to the book was what emerged out of that. Was me feeling the anxiety, feeling the confusion, the not hopelessness, but the despair about this whole process and what we have become in the church often, which is trying to buy and sell and trade baseball cards and get the highest player, and it feels like it's really a loss of who we are as a people.
There's a real sense of placedness in this book, and it brings to mind, authors whom I think that you love as well, Marilyn Robinson and Wendell Berry and Garrison Keillor. That this idea of a community that isn't a perfect community, it isn't idealized at all,
right?
And yet the people are kind of stuck there by choice or not by choice. Why did you choose to create a community that sort of fits this model, and what was it like for you to sort of imaginatively dwell there during the writing of the book?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, for my family, for my wife and I, theology of place has become very important to us. The more I think about my life as a Christian, as a human, I don't think that I could be who I am without a deep sense of where I belong. And I think that's one of the problems we struggle with in sort of our current expressions of church often. We're trying to replicate ways of life together and models that, perhaps we think could work as well in Omaha as they could in San Francisco, as well as they could in Portland, as well as they could in Chicago. And once we've said that, I think we've inherently sort of shown our cards, which is the incarnation tells us something very different, that the incarnation tells us that Jesus enfleshes himself in particular bodies, in particular places. And so Granby is a very common town. In fact, town might be a little too much of a word. It's almost a village. But it's, I think it was important for me for it not to be a place that had attractions outside of the fact that it is what it is.
Yeah. That
this is a place where people raise their families. This is a place where they do their work, where they hope for good futures, where they try to love their neighbor, where they decide, as Wendell says, they're not trying to be anybody. They think they already are somebody. They're not trying to get anywhere. They believe they already are somewhere, and that it's not what they create that makes them valuable. It's the sheer fact that they exist. That piece of land, that history, those family relationships cannot be replicated. And if they're severed, something is lost. And so I think a sense of place is crucial. And part of Thomas's task is to come in and honor that place. And I think maybe this was one of my convictions as a pastor. It's very tempting for people like me to come in with our grand plan for what a place is to be. And I think that's a very foolish and disingenuous way to pastor, because pastoring is supposed to be the most embodied, incarnated vocation that I know. It's to spend time to know people and to know where they are and who they're to become. And so I wanted to know Granby, like I wanted to know Charlottesville, and I hope that I've done that and maybe get a chance to do that even some more.
Now, one of the things that I think fiction allows us to do is to imagine a different reality and a different way of being that we might not have considered fully before. What do you hope pastors in particular take away from their experience with Pastor McAnn and the people of Granby? How do you hope that individual ministries will be affected by the journey that we take in this book?
Yeah. I would find it a real success if pastors would read these stories, encounter these people, and close that book and feel a lot of hope. And I would really hope that they would maybe have a renewed sense of, I can do this. I may not be able to do all these other things that somehow I feel like I'm being told I have to do, but things that rob me of my own humanity, rob me of my voice, maybe harm my family, and they say, I could do this. I can love a handful of people. I can be true to my sense of conviction about what it means to be a human seeking to live well in the kingdom of God. I can help people know how to be good neighbors. I can do my best to open up the scriptures and try to help people to see the living power of this word, and I can be humble enough to admit my failures, and I can be friends with people. And I would love it if pastors could just feel like a weight drop off their shoulders, and they would feel like they found perhaps a companion, a friend, somebody they'd like to go fishing with or take a hike in the woods with. And if they had that experience, and they would have a similar experience to what I found in these stories.